Hello, Year 10s. This week we're going to have a look at the impacts of transnational corporations. Firstly, think about what they are and then identify the impact they're having on Nigeria. Later on in this lesson, we're going to have a look at the environmental impacts of these transnational corporations and further industry in Nigeria. So, what is a TNC? Firstly, the abbreviation TNC is really important. You'll see this in quite a few questions, so it's useful to recognize this as a transnational corporation. Transnational corporations, as you saw in the previous slide, there were quite a few examples, so Nissan, Vodafone, Mercedes, to say a few. These operate across a number of countries but have their headquarters in high-income countries. Now, most of their manufacturing and industry is actually completed in low-income countries, and we're going to explore reasons for this in the next slide. So, why would a TNC want to set up in a low-income country? Now, there are four reasons here, the first of which is a tax incentive. This is where a government will offer a reduction in the amount of corporation tax that a corporation will have to pay, therefore encouraging them to want to work in that country. We've seen this in the UK, for example, with Amazon. Next, we have cheap labour. Now, in low-income countries, workers will earn less for the amount of time they are working. This is obviously recognised as a good thing by the company itself because therefore they can make more profit on the product that is produced. Again, we'll have seen this in the world with sweatshops, so companies like Nike and working in Indonesia and Philippines and India to exploit the cheap labour that is on in provision in these countries and therefore driving up the profit they can make on a single product. The third aspect is laxer environmental laws. Now, most of the products are made from raw materials and these need to be gained from the earth itself. In high-income countries, the environmental regulation is a lot stricter and therefore companies find it a lot harder to get the raw materials out of the ground. Now, in low-income countries, this is a lot easier and therefore TNCs tend to operate in these low-income countries. Finally, we have the access to a wider market. Again, this is driven by profit. Africa has a population of 1.2 billion, so it makes sense for a TNC to operate in a country such as Nigeria, where it can then have access to the wider market, selling that product and then hopefully promoting it further, therefore driving up the amount of money it can make. So there are a number of advantages and disadvantages of TNCs operating in low-income countries. In this case, we're going to consider Nigeria. Advantages tend to be from a social perspective, but also from an economic perspective. Companies will provide employment, so therefore the people themselves will benefit, earning higher wages and being able to spend that on obviously the economy, so shops or other aspects. Again, investment from the companies will result in improvements in local infrastructure, for example, roads, and other companies will benefit as a result of that. There are also some disadvantages. These tend to be social but also environmental. So the local workers are usually paid poorly or sometimes paid poorly. Working conditions as well can be quite poor. Again, this is seen throughout the world in cases in factories or the conditions in which they're working. One aspect which is obviously worth considering as well is that the TNCs are located in, well, the headquarters are located in high-income countries. So there's this consideration that actually much of the profit that is generated goes abroad and doesn't actually go to the country in which they are operating. Grants and subsidies are used to attract TNCs. It could have been used to invest in the Nigerian industry. Again, it's this consideration that it's taking money from Nigeria rather than feeding it into there. Again, there are some environmental considerations, but we're going to look at these in more detail further in the slide. So here we're going to consider the first question on your worksheet. So question 1, explain whether you think the presence of KFC is a positive or negative development for Nigeria. Again, just thinking back to what the last slide, you've got to look at obviously the positives, but also the disadvantages and the negative side of things. Again, things that you could add to that is this idea of there's an erosion of culture. So the implication that KFC itself is bringing Western ideals into Nigeria, and that might be eroding away sort of the traditional or cultural lifestyle. So on this slide, we're going to look at the impact that another TNC has had on Nigeria, in this case, Shell Oil. Shell, or Royal Dutch Shell as they're more formally known, are based in The Hague in the Netherlands. That's where they have their headquarters. They are a Anglo-Dutch company, so they operate both in the UK and the Netherlands. And they are often ranked in the top 5 in terms of production of oil and gas. So really quite a prolific company. They started exploration in Nigeria actually in 1937, but didn't discover oil until 1958. We're going to look at the impact of this oil discovery in the next couple of slides. So on this slide, we're going to look at the distribution of the oil fields in Nigeria. This goes with the worksheet. So question 2a, describe the distribution of oil fields in Nigeria using this map, or map C in the book. Question 2b, how does the location of Shell's Bonga oil field make oil extraction difficult? And then 2c, so explain why the location of the Bonga oil field increased the potential for environmental impacts. You're going to need to think here about obviously the location, so proximity to the ocean or the sea. So most of the oil fields and the connective infrastructure is located to the south of Nigeria. Again, considering maybe what people use the oceans for, or what people use the rivers for, and then the potential for contamination or accidents. So on this slide, we're going to start to think about some of the problems with extracting from the river delta itself. Shell and other companies obviously invest a large amount of money to extract the oil, but the laxer environmental regulations often mean there are problems associated with the extraction. Again, I'm going to link a video to your work, which also shows other issues in terms of extraction, such as piracy and theft. Now we're going to consider another TNC here, so Unilever. They're also an Anglo-Dutch TNC, which have joint headquarters in London and Rotterdam. They specialise in a number of brands, food, drinks and items for the home, and are often seen with their products in supermarkets. Again, the consideration here is that they help local communities and markets to develop new products, bringing through education and improved infrastructure for people in those nations. However, there's also a link to a video here which shows that actually there are additional problems associated with their work in Nigeria. And on this slide you can see the list of products that Unilever are responsible for producing. Some of them are more recognisable than the others, for example Lynx, Hellmann's, Lipton's, but in total they're all responsible for making over €1 billion in profit per year. So this is the practice question for this week's work. It's a 6-marker, and the title is to assess the costs and benefits of TNCs in Nigeria. This directly relates to Shell Oil in Nigeria, and what we've done for you is we've put the bullet points on page 227 under the case study into a table for both positive and negatives. I'm going to talk a little bit about why this is important on the next slide, where we're starting to think how we could plan this question. So here we're going to have a look at the planning of this question. First of all, an introduction. So what is a TNC? What do they do? And which TNC will you be discussing in your answer? So they'll need to have a brief discussion about Shell. Not too much, just what they do in relation to Nigeria. So the first part of this answer is going to be looking at the positives. So identify one positive that TNCs bring to Nigeria, again with reasonable evidence and an explanation. So here we've got an example, just so I've written out for you. So TNCs provide many additional job opportunities for Nigerians. That's the point. Evidence is taken from that table from the last slide, or from page 227, where Shell has provided 65,000 Nigerian workers with direct employment and a further 250,000 jobs in related industries. Again, that's a multiplier effect. Furthermore, then we need to talk about the explanation. So this is a major benefit for the individuals and their family members, as they can earn a stable income or a more stable income and use their higher spending power to improve their quality of life. For example, spending money on education or necessities such as food or water. That's one side. Then you need to think about the opposite side. So actually we've talked about the advantages. What about the disadvantages? Again, you could look at it from an environmental aspect. You could look at it from a social aspect. So what are the bullet points suggesting for that? Finally, a conclusion. So overall, your opinion, do you feel like Shell brings more positives, or do you feel like it brings more negatives, or whether you feel it is an equal argument? The next part of the lesson is managing environmental issues. This has jumped on to page 230 and 231. It fits quite nicely with what we've just looked at from Shell. And also here we're going to consider how economic development in Nigeria has had an impact on the environment through industrial growth, urban growth, commercial farming, and mining and oil extraction. Here we're going to consider how economic growth affects the environment. Now, obviously, rapid economic growth is a good thing for social aspects, but also the economy, helping the people in that country and also the country itself. However, usually economic growth also brings problems to the environment, and we've seen this in the UK in the 1800s through the Industrial Revolution and the problems that brought with it. Here in London we had the Thames being declared as dead, and further afield problems with air pollution and waterborne diseases like cholera. Now, this is also something which we're seeing in the world at the moment in places like China, where air quality is particularly bad. Also, if we think about issues with global warming, a large problem is the production of carbon and methane that these industries are creating. The first aspect which we're going to consider is industrial growth. This has mainly come about as Nigeria has moved from a primary sector based on agriculture and the extraction of raw materials into a secondary sector focusing on the production of goods. As it mentions on the slide, Nigeria is home to around 5,000 registered industrial plants. However, it is also home to an additional 10,000 illegal small-scale industries. And this unregulated growth of industry has created major problems for the environment and the people living there. Most notably, it's creating a lot of health problems. So the factories themselves are releasing harmful pollutants not just into the air but into the water itself, and disposing of chemical waste on nearby land. The next aspect we're going to consider is urban growth. So as Nigeria has developed, urban areas have also grown rapidly. This is most evident in the city of Lagos, which in 1960 had a population of around 200,000. That has now reached around 20 million. Problems this brings are squatter settlements, so people being unable to afford homes and as a result living in self-made settlements. Again, services are unable to keep up with the pace, with the rate of the economic growth as well. So problems that brings as well, maybe education, maybe health. Waste disposal has also become a major issue that's seen in photo B, and then also a problem which is really visible in Lagos as well is traffic congestion. Traffic congestion in Nigerian cities as a whole, it can sometimes be up to 2 to 3 hours. Commercial farming and deforestation is the next aspect we're going to quickly look at. So the annual rate of deforestation, as it mentions here, is 3.5% in Nigeria. Now that doesn't put it anywhere near the top in terms of countries that are clearing their forests, but it does actually come in 49th place. Again, as it mentions here, Nigeria's forest has mainly been cleared for logging of timber, but more notably in recent years, agriculture. So the clearing of forests to create space for crops like yam or palm oil. Now, obviously, this is creating a large-scale issue for climate change, but also has an impact on the wildlife and the biodiversity in the area. As it mentions in the textbook, species of cheetahs, giraffes, and nearly 500 types of plant. So mining and oil extraction is the final aspect which we're going to consider. Now, we've already identified some of the problems created through oil extraction with our case study of Shell. Obviously, oil extraction or oil spills can cause a huge amount of problem environmentally. Locally, they can damage marine ecosystems and the people who rely on them, but also globally, creating problems through CO2 and issues with the atmosphere. Tin mining is another aspect where soil erosion becomes a problem, and then also local water supplies can be polluted with toxic chemicals, resulting in health issues to local populations. The final aspect there is this idea of conflict around the oil supply. Again, that's linked to the video that I'm going to have added onto the worksheets. The last slides here are related to the Bodo oil spills of 2008 and 2009. This is a mini case study of sorts, and it occurred in 2008 where two major oil spills devastated the area of Bodo. As it mentions, 11 million gallons of crude oil spilt over a 20-kilometre area, and the local industry of farming and fishing was massively impacted. So people couldn't afford to make any money, and as a result couldn't afford to feed their family. Now, Shell have always claimed that the theft of crude oil and sabotage was the major problem behind this. However, in 2015, following a 7-year protest, they actually agreed to pay $55 million in compensation in what was a first.